Let's speak now to Ranjeet Brar, leader of the British Communist Party. Ranjeet, good to have you on the program with us. So the U.S. defense chief skipped the Ramstein group meeting for the first time since its creation in 2022. In this day and age of Zoom, what could possibly have kept him so busy that he couldn't attend?
It was a good question. Good to be with you, Rachel. There's no hiding the contempt that the United States imperialists feel for the Europeans. They're putting them under consistent pressure. Really, the entire spectacle of the Ukraine war has been pressuring the Europeans into war with their nearest neighbor, to their great detriment, to their great economic cost. And particularly as we saw the bombing over Yemen, when we saw Signalgate and we saw the messages exchanged between Hegseth and Trump and their other inner clique. They were very open about the contempt that they had, that they hold the leaders of the European states, in particularly Germany, France and Britain, who they constantly pressure right now to increase their spending. But all of their spending and all of that, that angle of their policy is designed to benefit chiefly U.S. imperialism, because U.S. imperialism is ultimately the military, which is the backbone of NATO. And it's upon NATO that all of these countries within the EU and Britain have ceded their overall sovereignty and their, if you like, the military backing of their financial power.
The head of Ukraine's delegation at the Ramstein meeting insisted that U.S. Ukrainian cooperation is strong despite Hegseth's absence. What's your assessment of the recent dynamics regarding this relationship?
It's clear that Trump came into office saying he was going to get peace within 24 hours, within days, then within weeks. I think he might genuinely have a desire to back out of this conflict, but he wants to do so in such a way as to ultimately preserve the power and integrity of Anglo-American imperialism, of EU imperialism, and of NATO. And it's clear there's not a way to do that. I mean, the Russian leadership have been really like chess grandmasters, playing people who are more used to playing checkers or Ludo. They have persistently been very slow to be angered. They've been very slow to come into war. They spent a decade between 2014 and the beginning of the special military operation trying to avoid war, trying to have peace, trying to conclude a broader security agreement for Europe, trying to indicate that if NATO continued to expand, that this would be a red line, particularly if they're going to come into neighboring states, former republics of the Soviet Union, the Baltics. I think when NATO expanded into the Baltics, they thought, oh, well, here we've got a red light, we've got a green light rather to expand wherever we want. But they made it extremely clear in 2008 that in particular Ukraine and Georgia would be red lines, despite the war in Georgia, despite NATO's defeat there. NATO still had as its inner goal, despite all protestations to the contrary, to expand right up into Ukraine, to install the fascist junta in Ukraine and Kiev, and to use them as a battering ram to try and again get what they consider to be the golden period, the 1990-91 period when the Soviet Union collapsed, and suddenly their capital of the Anglo-American imperialists and Europeans was free to penetrate the Soviet Union when they looted the resources of the Soviet people in the Eastern Bloc. This was a bonanza for them. It's not widely recognized the extent to which the imperialist economy, the global capitalist economy, was in a deep crisis, which they managed to get out of through ultimately checkmating and defeating their Soviet and communist socialist rivals.
Ranjeet, the UK has stepped up to co-lead the Ukraine Defence Contact Group now that the US has backed off. As a British politician yourself, what do you think about that?
It's an enormous mistake, but you can see that if you look at our Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, people don't realise always just the extent to which the Labour Party, which is considered by many in our country to be a left-wing party, a socialist party, a party of peace, a party for the working people, they don't realise its the extent to which it's a party of imperialism, a party of war. And the British ruling class, which had an empire upon which the sun never set until very recently, really considers itself it has the right to rule over vast swathes of the territory. And then, despite all its protestations about democracy, really, it doesn't strive for democracy; it strives for domination. And the Labour Party has become part of that system of running British imperialism. So it was a Labour Prime Minister, Clement Attlee, who founded NATO and who was the driving force behind it on behalf of the British ruling class in our country, the really wealthy, financial, corporate and landed elite who merged with the aristocracy and the business elite, really do drive our politics and rule our country despite the facade of so-called freedom. So it's not unusual. Keir Starmer, before he was elected, wrote a kind of major article in our press in which he said the institution of which he was most proud was not the National Health Service, but was NATO. And NATO was the institution by which he would be judged, preserving and strengthening that institution. Well, actually, NATO is in tatters. It's driving towards its own ruin through its expansion and through its defeat on the battlefield in Ukraine. But the British ruling class, in particular, in alliance with, if you like, the neocon establishment, who still form a very significant faction of the American ruling class, though they would not be naturally allied to Trump and his populism, they really do see the only way forward for their system, which is in a deep economic crisis, as the continued expansion of NATO, because NATO is, guarantees the economic area in which their capital will dominate. And they are very worried about Russia. They're very worried about China. Trump is not some kind of peacenik. He wants to simply switch tactics because they've failed to defeat Russia and break Russia. On the contrary, Russia's economy seems to be growing and strengthening whilst the NATO economies are weakening. And he wants to pivot, like Obama, towards Asia. He's made it very clear and very plain that is the plan. He's going to fail in that attempt even more heavily than he has currently failed. But in the meantime, Starmer, fronting the NATO powers, acting on behalf of British capital, absolutely wants to keep pumping weapons into Ukraine in the vain hope, that they can somehow snatch a win from a victory from the jaws of defeat. It's clear that all of these recent, provocations with the drone attacks on Moscow, with the attacks on the strategic bombers of Russia, which actually turned out not to be very successful, but are being trumpeted in our country as if they were a major blow, that they're a violation of our treaty obligations to avoid nuclear war. So all of this saber rattling, this incredibly reckless gambling behavior is really being pushed by the desperation that underlies the economic crisis of our ruling class. And I'm afraid Keir Starmer is nothing more than a loyal servant, and quite an ignorant one. And as an ignorant one, he's easy to push into, quite obscene postures because he doesn't really understand the implications of the positions that he's chasing.
All right, Ranjeet Brar, leader of the British Communist Party.